Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions. We are in the throes of what will be long remembered as an annus horribilis, gentle listener. Our humble narrator has informed me that anyone tuning in to our little production in this troubling time is seeking escape, and not my ill-qualified musings and analysis of the situation. A little insulting, but I take the hint. So I shall forego my usual prevarication and self-indulgence to deliver you directly into the arms of our featured story. However, before I do, I would just like to say, be safe, be hopeful, be kind. All right, that's my 2 cents worth. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present Dan Soule's The Slaughterman's Tale. There had been many last hours in the slaughterhouse. Now it was time for its own. Sidney, the longest-serving slaughterman, was given the honour of performing the final clean-down and turning off the lights. All the small abattoirs were closing. Rationalisation or something. Sidney had slurred to the landlord, Rupert, the previous evening over his 5th pint at the hearty good fellow. All the work was going to an industrial-sized facility in Newark. More machines than people. Bloody fetcher, Sidney had concluded. Others overheard, and the small pub quickly became overcrowded with tales of woe. Rupert decided there would be no lock-in for the regulars tonight, sending the men out into the night and back to their wives, like the closing of an unwanted abattoir. No matter how thick Sidney laid it on the night before, it didn't affect his work. Not really. As Sid swept the floor through the fug of last night's drinks, his thoughts were careful not to touch on the idea lurking somewhere out of sight. It wasn't about where he'd find work at his age in a world of machines and computers and money. No, it was more of an itch, a scratching insect pestering, pulling at him, calling him to that thing he desired most. Sidney had worked at the abattoir as man and boy, leaving school at 15, although he would have left earlier if his mother, God rest her soul, would have let him. A slaughterman's work suited him. Moo, thunk, moo, thunk, moo, thunk, and so on. It was the kind of work that needed to be done, but no one wanted to see, put out on the edge, in the corner of the town's eye, so that it cannot be seen, but everyone knows it is there. They were all gone now. The abattoir was now all but closed. Managers and council officials were due back tomorrow to check everything was in order. Sidney pulled a quarter bottle of vodka from his slaughterman's white coat pocket and took a swig, raising the bottle briefly in the air to toast his surroundings. In over 40 years, this was the first time he had had a drink on the job. What were they going to do? Fire him? He put the bottle back in his pocket and swept down the remaining tiled floor with detergent. The head of the brush shushed the liquid in soporific waves, as if hushing the building to sleep. Shh, shh, shh. It was one of the many sounds of routine that typified a slaughterman's work, sending the animals as peacefully as possible off to their final rest. Moo, Thunk. Moo. Thunk. Moo. Thunk. Death was a banal habit of this place, opening a welcoming door. Or at least it once did. After turning off the lights and locking up, Sydney's work was done. A trip to the Hearty tonight didn't feel like a good idea, all the commiseration and reminiscing. Things always got so maudlin when he reminisced. It would be the same if he went straight home. All the bloody questions. Are you okay, Dad? How do you feel, dear? When will you go down the job centre, love? Instead, he would pull up a chair and have a drink with the slaughterhouse, the one thing other than his mother, God rest her soul, that didn't care if he was feeling okay and wouldn't ask him 20 questions. A pair of folding chairs overlooked the holding pens from the iron gangway. Sydney chose one and sat down. He was 2/3 down his bottle of vodka, a warm fug padding his brain, when chains tinkled in the pens below. Running his hand over his stubbly face, Sydney got up to check, peering over the balustrade. Probably just a rat, he thought. They don't waste any time. There was nothing there, only a couple of chains swinging in the colliginous light of dusk. He sat back down. Glorious evening, isn't it? Sydney jolted on his chair, turning to face the voice that addressed him. My good fellow, I didn't mean to startle you, said the man sitting next to Sydney. The gentleman, for he did have the look of a gentleman in that old-fashioned sense, was dapperly attired in a black dinner jacket, replete with white flower in his button, a top hat and a silver-topped cane. His face had a long, goatish look, or perhaps that was just the effect of the thin goatee on his chin. Where the bloody hell did you come from? Asked Sydney, grasping for an explanation, his heart pounding in his chest, firstly at the inexplicability of the man's arrival, and secondly at being caught, drinking, on the job. The doorway, of course, my dear fellow. Places like this are full of doorways, Sydney, aren't they? Yes, but Sydney tried to conceal the bottle of vodka. Oh, don't worry about that, Sydney. What are they going to do? Fire you? The man chuckled, and Sydney felt he should do the same, feeling a little more at ease. I thought you lot were coming tomorrow. Everything is done, said Sydney. I'm sure it is. Looks like you've done a fine job. Could I have a sip of that? Said the gentleman, gesturing for the bottle. Sydney passed it over convivially. The man took a sip and handed it back with a grin, although it was the kind of grin that might be mistaken for a sneer if you didn't know him very well. But Sydney felt he did, although he couldn't explain why. They sat in comfortable silence, passing the bottle between them. Sydney was glad not to answer any questions, but wanted to ask a few of his own to get to know his drinking partner a little better. However, with the first question forming on his lips, the gentleman answered, Mr. Nicholas is my name. He took a sip and passed back the bottle. I just thought I'd pop in as I was passing and check everything is in order. Sydney gave the bottle back to Mr. Nicholas and was about to ask, for a man who doesn't like questions, you are quite fond of asking them, aren't you? Mr. Nicholas said lightly. Well, if you really want to know, I'll tell you. Conspiratorially, Mr. Nicholas leaned into Sydney. Sydney leaned in too. He felt pulled magnetically, like he felt with a drink sometimes. It wasn't a conscious thing. He could be out for a Sunday walk and all of a sudden find himself at the hearty Goodfellow, pulling crumpled pound notes out of his pocket, ordering a pint. Mr. Nicholas's eyes were like that. Suggestive, charming, irresistible. That sneer, or was it a smile, spread across Mr. Nicholas's face. This close, Sidney noticed it for the first time, the smell of sulphur. Perhaps Mr. Nicholas had had to check on a chemical factory in the day, thought Sidney. Mr. Nicholas's eyebrows arched high to near points at their apex, and his eyes, his charming eyes, held Sidney's. You see, Sidney, what I'm really about is investment. Investment in the future. And I like to check on my investments. You understand that, don't you, Sidney? Sidney nodded. Of course you do. A man such as yourself knows all too well about such things, Mr. Nicholas said sympathetically. It's cost you your livelihood. And what thanks does Sid get? Oh, clean down and turn off the lights, old boy. Greater unseen forces are reshaping the world around you. No one cares about the little man anymore, do they, Sidney? But I do, Sidney. I do. Mr. Nicholas never blinked. His eyes were such a light brown that Sidney thought they could be considered yellow, like stars, with such terrible gravity that the more he spoke, the more Sid was pulled in. Anyway, it's your last day, old boy. There's no need to be all philosophical. It only leads to being maudlin, and we wouldn't want that, would we? Sidney shook his head drunkenly. Those eyes, those yellowish eyes, pulled with the rhythm of the slaughterhouse. Moo, thunk, moo, thunk, moo. Sidney lurched away. Something scurried across Mr. Nicholas's eyeball. Something black, something insidious. A dark moon crossing the face of its sun. Whatever's the matter, old boy? Mr. Nicholas said, his sneer, or was it a smile, spreading wide. Sidney pointed, stuttering. Mr. Nicholas inclined his head, eyebrows raised questioningly, the smile smoothing to a knowing smirk. His face was unusual, but not out of the ordinary, apart from those yellow, or were they brown, eyes. Sidney thought the booze must be getting to him. Then the black thing bulged unnaturally under Mr. Nicholas's lower eyelid for a moment before popping out and scurrying down his bony cheek and up his nostril. Sidney fell off his chair in shock and revulsion. Mr. Nicholas laughed, a deep, baleful laugh. Propped up on his elbows, the old slaughterman lay paralyzed with shock, as if caught between what his eyes saw and what he thought he should be seeing, unable to reconcile dream and reality because they had inexplicably switched roles. The sneer was back on Mr. Nicholas's face. The black arachnid crawled out of his other nostril and into his right ear, its ganglion body struggling briefly with the tight hole to then pop out of sight. A moment later it scurried from his left ear, lurching back to the corner of Mr. Nicholas's left eye. tendril leg scratched at the pink flesh of the eyelid, pulling it back like the fingers of a bank teller leafing through a roll of notes, exposing the naked white eyeball beneath, to bury itself under flesh once again. The gentleman never flinched. Not even a bit. Sidney's heart pounded, and underneath his white slaughterman's coat, he made water in his coveralls. In the abiding odour of the abattoir, urine mixed familiarly with detergent. It was the smell of manners and propriety covering up fear and death, like makeup on a corpse, flowers on a grave, plastic wrapping on a stake. Slowly the smile slid from Mr. Nicholas's face. His mouth opened wide in a yawning black maw, endlessly deep, terrifyingly dark, an abyss so infinite a soul would lose itself within. Yet it was a mouth, surely. It was only a mouth. Sidney's mind raced. The gaping jaws were edged with unforgiving ivory shards, glinting dully like dying stars in a festering galaxy, whose civilizations worshipped only gods of war and death and cruelty. "No!" shouted Sidney's mind. "No! No! No!" A mind's cry, as futile and foolish as the king who believes he can hold back the tide. From the dark came a slithering tongue, crawling out into the dying light of the slaughterhouse, a thing of the shadows and twilight, a predatory thing ending in a point at the tip of a goateed chin. But it just as easily could be the great worm Vortkmore, the serpent of Neverdream and Avarice, come to devour the world while all slept, crawling from the underworld to the tip of a mountain turned on its end, in a world that had forsaken all reason and care for anything natural and orderly. Along the back of the grey serpent it came, scuttling, the willing, undead servant. The spider appeared from Mr. Nicholas's throat, creeping down his grey tongue, and with it came the smell of sulphurous death. Brimstone choked Sidney, stealing his breath, burning his nostrils, while sweet putrefaction tortured what remained of his sanity in a torrent of burning bile that wanted to vomit this offence to life. When the spider reached the tongue's end, it fell briefly before catching the tension in its rough silken thread and lowering itself to the ground in slow, successive lurches. There it scurried off to the edge of the gangway and disappeared. A pain shot down Sidney's arms, as hot as a molten knife pulled down his veins, and as if realizing all life is pain, that being is suffering, that death is inevitable as surely as cattle low, and the bolt gun thunk into their temples, over and over in an endless parade of death, cruel and sanitized and necessary. It was over. Sidney blinked away the horror. The pain was gone. There was no spider, no grey tongue, no smell of the underworld. It was just the booze, or an hallucination, or a dream like some terrible soap opera on a Wednesday evening. Mr. Nicholas gave Sidney another of his smiles, picked up his cane and tipped his hat. "Thank you for the drink. old boy. Sidney's mind groped hungrily at the return of his old reality, a cold sweat running down his back. He watched Mr. Nicholas walk away to the door at the end of the gangway, but back in this old reality where the previous horrors of a moment ago were only a dream, the sound of those footsteps were not right. They did not fit. They were somehow still unnatural, abnormal, an abomination. Sidney couldn't put his finger on it. It was a sound the old slaughterman had heard many times in this place, so many times he couldn't count. A sound that always preceded the mooing and thunking routines of the slaughterhouse, but had no business being connected to a man. The gentleman's steps clip-clopped on the dimpled metal walkway, each time his cloven foot mincingly struck the floor. Sidney closed his eyes tightly, shaking his head. When he opened them again, he lay in a puddle of his own urine, alone. Just a drunk old slaughterman finishing off his final shift before turning out the lights for the last time. The Slaughterman's Tale by Dan Soule. If you enjoyed this story, you may be happy to know that Mr. Soule's very first horror novel, Neolithica, is now available. You'll find a link and more information about Mr. Soule in the featured authors section of our website, nocturnaltransmissions.com.au. Hello to our latest Nocturnal Transmissions Patreon acolytes, Jack Ship and Randy. Welcome aboard. Now, before we go, it's time for another installment of Nocturnal Transmissions Recommends. Now, I know what you're thinking. You think I'm going to say, wash your hands, and then chuckle away as if I couldn't be more pleased with myself. No, gentle listener, no. I think you'll find I'm not so predictable. Although, do wash your hands. No, our recommendation this time around is something of a more literary nature. I believe many of you out there in the real world are currently laying low and wondering what the dickens to do with yourselves. Why, gentle listener, it is under just such circumstances that Nocturnal Transmissions Recommends can help. Our recommendation this time around is the comic book work of Mike Mignola, more specifically his Hellboy series. First published way back in 1994, this wonderful comic book series has been widely praised and lavished with awards, and adapted into 2 feature films, both directed by Guillermo del Toro and starring Ron Perlman. In case you don't know, our titular character is a muscle-bound red demon with filed-down horns and a blue-collar, no-nonsense approach to battling the forces of darkness, amongst whose number he is often reminded he is meant to be counted. As is often the trope in such monster-among-men stories, Hellboy, despite his infernal origins, displays more humanity than his human counterparts. He is a John McClane-type figure, quipping his way through encounters with the most nefarious and humorless of villains imaginable. It's good fun, gentle listener, and my oh my, that artwork. Every page is to be studied and admired. Every panel a minimalist masterpiece of graphic art worthy of framing. Mignola's style is simply masterful. If you like comic book art and have yet to discover his work, you are in for a treat. I would advise seeking out the omnibus editions, which collect his adventures together in chronological order. There are 4. 1, Seed of Destruction. 2, Strange Places. 3, The Wild Hunt. And the concluding collection, 4, Hellboy in Hell. Mike Mignola's Hellboy, Nocturnal Transmissions. What's that you say? There's a 3rd film. Yes, well, I was always told that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Oh, well, I suppose I liked the Baba Yaga scenes, but that's about it, I'm afraid. Anyway, best we just pretend that one didn't happen. I'm sure David Harbour agrees. And we're talking about the comic books anyway, not the films. So, as I was saying, Mike Mignola's Hellboy, Nocturnal Transmissions, recommends it. This episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our cohorts: Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Evan Dooley, Sam Bell, Michael Wood, and Sanitarium Magazine. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.